All right, today we are diving deep into a really powerful and, let's be honest, pretty challenging theological work from way back in 1898. We're going to unpack Andrew Murray's The School of Obedience. Right from the very beginning, in the preface, Murray does not pull any punches. He sets the stage by framing obedience not as some chore, but as an indispensable necessity. And get this, a source of inconceivable blessedness. For him, this isn't just one topic among many, it's everything. So, here's how we're going to break down his argument. First, we'll look at what Murray actually means by obedience. Then, we'll trace his logic through the whole biblical story. After that, we'll see why he points to Christ as the perfect example, understand his whole metaphor about how we're supposed to learn this, and finally, we'll tie it all together with the idea of faith. Okay, first things first. Before we can go anywhere else, we have to get on the same page with Murray's foundational definition of what obedience even is. It's the key to his whole argument. See, for Murray, this is not about ticking boxes off some kind of cosmic to-do list. He talks about absolute obedience as this complete, constant surrender. It's a state of being, really, aligning your will with God's will in every single moment, not just, following a bunch of static rules. And here is the absolute core of his argument. Murray says that obedience isn't just one good quality among many, like being brave or being kind. No. In his view, it is the foundational virtue, the one single thing God requires that holds everything else up. Okay, so let's see how he builds this case. Murray argues that this whole theme isn't just an isolated idea. He sees it as this unbroken chain running through the entire biblical story, from the very first page to the very last. And what's so fascinating is how Murray frames the entire Bible as this grand story about obedience. It kicks off in Genesis, right, where one act of disobedience slams the door to the tree of life. The huge pivot point comes in the Gospels, where Christ's perfect obedience on the cross opens that door right back up. And then it all concludes in Revelation, where obedience is the literal key that lets you walk through that door and access the regained tree of life. It's a perfect story arc. This right here illustrates the whole problem and solution in a nutshell, according to the text. Murray points to the book of Romans to draw this perfect parallel. Adam's one act of disobedience messed everything up, bringing sin and death into the picture. And in perfect, stark contrast, Christ's one act of obedience made things right, bringing righteousness and life. And to show just how high the stakes are, Murray brings up the story of King Saul. The command he got from the prophet Samuel was super simple, super specific. Just wait 7 days. But Saul gets antsy. He kind of sort of obeys, but then he just takes matters into his own hands and does the sacrifice himself. The consequence? It's immediate and it's devastating. His kingdom is taken away. For Murray, this is a crystal clear lesson that close enough isn't good enough. Partial obedience is treated as complete disobedience. And this famous line, what Samuel says to Saul, is the big takeaway for Murray. The simple act of obeying is presented as way more valuable than even the most religious-looking rituals. It's not about the outward show, the sacrifice. It's about the inward heart of pure, simple obedience. So after laying out the problem and just how serious the consequences are, Murray shifts gears. He moves to what he sees as the ultimate solution and the perfect role model, Jesus Christ himself. According to Murray, this one quote from the Gospel of John basically sums up Christ's entire life. It was a life completely defined by submitting his own will to the Father's will. And that becomes the template for what true obedience is supposed to look like. So Murray then breaks down what this obedience actually looked like in practice. It wasn't just, a series of good deeds. It was a core life principle. And it wasn't a drag for him. He actually described it as a joy, a delight. It was total, going all the way to death. And, so importantly, it came from a place of deep humility and was an act of total faith, completely relying on the Father's strength, not his own. So, if Christ is the perfect model, how in the world does a regular person learn to live like that? This is where Murray introduces his big metaphor, and it's a great one, the school of obedience. And he lays out the structure of this school really simply. The teacher is Jesus Christ. The textbook is the Bible. And the student? Well, that's any believer who's willing to sign up for the class. Now, here's where Murray makes a really fascinating distinction. He argues that just knowing the textbook isn't enough. Look at the contrast. He says Israel got the laws from a man, Moses, and from a book. And what was the result? A long history of disobedience. But then you have Christ, who lived in this constant, direct communication with the Father. The result? Perfect obedience. The lesson here is that true learning doesn't just come from the text, it comes from a living relationship with the teacher. So, what does it take to be a good student in this school? Well, Murray says you need a few things. First, unhesitating submission. You just have to do what the teacher says. Second, absolute trust in that teacher. And third, you have to be willing to give it your full time and attention. It's an all-in kind of commitment, for sure. And all of this builds to the final and maybe the most important connection. Murray argues that this entire system, this school of obedience, is powered by one thing and one thing only: faith. He points to Abraham as the poster child for this. I mean, think about it. Abraham obeyed a command to pack up and leave, and he went out without even knowing where he was going. Why would anyone do that? Because of faith. His obedience wasn't based on having a map. It was based on trusting the one who gave him the directions. And this is really the ultimate takeaway from Murray's whole book. Faith and obedience are inseparable. They're like two sides of the same coin. You can't have one without the other. Faith isn't just some passive belief. For Murray, it's the actual engine that powers a life of obedience. It's what makes this seemingly impossible life of absolute surrender actually possible. Which leaves us with a pretty provocative final thought, doesn't it? In our world today, a world that really celebrates individualism, personal freedom, and self-will, this 19th century call for absolute obedience sounds incredibly countercultural. It really challenges us to stop and think about what we value, what or who we're willing to submit to, and where we ultimately place our trust.